Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is David Leiser. He is a full professor of economic and social psychology at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Israel. He is past president of the International Association for Research in Economic Psychology and president of the Economic Psychology Division of the International Association of Applied Psychology. He studies lay conceptions, especially in the economic domain. As you'll hear from the conversation, it's mostly psychology and not so much boring economics. I know they call it the dismal science. His book is called How We Misunderstand Economics and Why It Matters. So we mostly talk about those kinds of issues that befuddle not just voters, but all of us. You know, what is an economy? What does it mean to grow an economy? Why is it not really like a fixed pie? And why, when someone else has more than I have, it doesn't mean I can't get that? And what does it mean to slap tariffs on China? And so we get into all that. Plus, then I end talking about reparations for reparations for African Americans, and thus perhaps maybe Native Americans. And what about the analogs, since David is Jewish and lives in Israel? Germany paying reparations for the Holocaust in more recent times, and so on. So we get into that as well. Lots of interesting topics. Again, if you support the podcast, appreciate the podcast, you can support it at skeptic.com/donate, either directly through the Skeptic Society or through Patreon. Actually, I meant to open this conversation with David with one of my favorite quotes from an economist, John Maynard Keynes, from his General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, from 1935. Why I think, even though I'm not that interested personally in economics, I think it's one of the most important things anybody can study. Here's the quote from Keynes. "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. I am sure that the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas." I like that because personally, that's my job, is trafficking in ideas, whether they're true or false, weird ideas, true ideas, normal ideas, all kinds of ideas. I think that is what rules the world. That is what drives economies and political systems, ideologies, and so on. It's ideas that are behind it, which is why I think it's important we study all of them, but in particular also economic ones. So with that, I give you David Leiser. Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. Thanks for coming on, David. Your new book is How We Misunderstand Economics and Why It Matters. The subtitle is The Psychology of Bias, Distortion, and Conspiracy. Especially that last part got my attention. So, but before we dive into your book, give us a little bit of background. I'm speaking to you in Israel. So you are a professor there at the Ben-Gurion University in Negev, Israel, and you're past president of the International Association for Research in Economic Psychology, and so on and so on. Tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are now.
By a very roundabout way, I started off by studying mathematics, actually. I have a full degree in mathematics from the Hebrew University. Then I moved to adult education, which is a topic that has been interesting me forever, all the way to that book. That is trying to bring knowledge to people, and the book represents that effort in a way. Then I did my PhD in Geneva with Jean Piaget, the famous developmental psychologist. And I was a research assistant of him for a while. Then I had a girlfriend at the University of Chicago, and I decided I didn't quite have my PhD yet, but I went there to speak to the head of the department and said that I would like to teach there. And then at the ripe age of 26, I believe, I was there an invited professor at the University of Chicago. Then I went to the Max Planck Institute in Holland. And then I came to Israel, where I am now, and I live in Jerusalem. working as a social psychologist, economic psychologist, and there you have it in a nutshell.
Wow. Well, that explains a lot of the psychology in your book. You obviously have a great interest in cognitive psychology, social psychology, and that kind of makes sense. So you were at the University of Chicago, kind of the height at the Chicago School of Economics.
No, actually, I was in a thing. I don't know how familiar you are with the U of C. It's a fantastic institution, but they have their own little special ways of doing things. In particular, they had a committee called Committee on Cognition and Communication, which fitted to a T. And so that's where I spent a year also teaching also a bit of artificial intelligence, because I think I'm a bit like yourself, a bit of a polymath.
Right. Well, I brought that up, the Chicago School of Economics, because that's kind of that Austrian school of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and leaning more toward free market economics rather than heavily regulated economics. I don't know how much of that has influenced your economic thinking, or if that's a different track.
It's really more of Hayek is one thing that I can mention here is that Hayek said that we have evolved to function in small societies. We have evolved to not to work in the modern economic, and much of the argument of my book is really based on the premise that we are really not built to understand economics. We mean current day humans, because we have the mental makeup of our forefathers who were adapted to entirely different conditions. And the book sort of draws out in details how all the places where this shows up. And Hayek is somebody who, you may know that, pointed out that thing in himself. But really, I'm not an economist. I'm really a psychologist mostly. And I have read quite a bit, but I don't think I should be speaking as an economist. I think that wouldn't be responsible.
Well, it's interesting that Danny Kahneman, won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's not an economist either. He's a psychologist. But the study of human psychology is really at base the study of choices, and those include economic choices. And there's the link to behavioral economics from evolutionary economics, and then just evolutionary psychology, and then you're off and running with cognitive psychology and so on. I start off my book. I wrote a book called The Mind of the Market, which on evolutionary economics, talking about, as you do, with folk economics. That is to say, our ancestors evolved in these small bands of hunter-gatherer groups where there was no wealth, there was no division of labor, there was no, invisible hand in the marketplace, because there was no marketplace as we think of it. So there's one of the things that makes economics difficult to grasp, and as you point out, easy to misunderstand, is that there's nothing to hook it on in the brain. That there's no metaphors that just automatically come to mind. So you have that whole section on metaphors, the use of metaphors in economics, because it's otherwise, what is an economy? I mean, what do you even hook that on in your brain?
That's exactly it. I think, especially if you go from a group comprised of a few hundred people, and then you move to something like a whole nation, be it even 5 million people, it doesn't have to be 200. There are emergent properties, and we are terrible in understanding emergent properties of any kind. One good example is the theory of evolution. Turns out that it's very difficult to understand, and even when you teach it, and then you test students, at some point you realize that actually they have reconstructed it in a way that fits some sort of teleological, that really nature wants to do something, which is precisely the opposite from what a proper understanding of evolution tells us. That's very striking. And in particular, in economics, if you have you try to understand national or international economics, that involves so many actors who don't have any particular care about, who don't try to organize the whole economy. They try to mind their own business, and the emergent effects of all that are very hard to fathom. And therefore, economic policy is very hard to understand. And people have trouble understanding economic policy, and because they don't understand, but because for other reasons we may go into, they believe they do understand, the outcome is they often become very suspicious of those in authority.
Yeah, understandably, because for most of human history, including our prehistory, anyone that had an inordinate amount of stuff probably got it illegally or immorally or surreptitiously or conspiratorially. We think of earning wealth or something like that, but there was nothing like that in our ancestors' history. So when there was asymmetries of wealth, probably there were shenanigans going on. So there probably are good reasons to be distrustful of people that have a lot of wealth.
You can also look at it otherwise, even more of an evolutionary thing, not just because we are different from the way it was, but because equality was very much of a value. If you have a small group of, hunters, as one day you'll go out hunting and you won't find anything, but I will, and one day it will be the other way around. The best way for us as a group to survive is that, well, whoever manages to, kill an antelope, shares with everybody else. You put it in the middle of the marketplace, and then everybody shares, and that way you sort of smooth out all the vagaries of whatever happened. So we have it built in ourselves, that feeling that large disparities are wrong. I believe that's where it comes from. The morality of it comes from, because otherwise we evolved as a group to function well in those conditions.
Yeah, they say, anthropologists say that these hunter-gatherer groups are egalitarian, but it's kind of a forced egalitarian. I mean, people will cheat a little bit if they can get away with it. They'll maybe lag back a little bit on the hunt, maybe take a tiny bit more than they should in the food sharing. So you have to have rules about that.
No, that's adaptive. That certainly is adaptive, to try to have everybody follow the rules and you don't follow them. So it's true. We have all tendencies to try to cut corners. Then we have a different type of more conscious morality, which may be based in education, in religion, in thought and philosophical understanding, which tells us, okay, well, of course, I'm tempted, but I won't do it. That's certainly true. But it remains the case that as a social norm, saying that some people have more than others is wrong is something that is probably deeply rooted.
Yeah, I think so. It's like there's this constant tension in human nature between our inner demons and our better angels, and the whole point of a civil society or any kind of society with rules is to try to nudge you in the direction toward, erring on the side of slightly better behavior and avoiding slightly more negative behavior that hurts the group. And that seems to like summarize all of human history right there, just that tension.
Yes, and it really is an open question whether we should, as a modern society that could function differently, whether we are really beholden to those things that we happen to have, happen is not the right word, but that we do have inherited from the past. I mean, not everything that is deeply ingrained in our past is necessarily a good thing. To give you just an obvious example, nepotism is very deeply, you see all the people, all the despots who have the possibility of benefiting more their kin than others, once they have enough power, they'll do it. And it's deeply ingrained, and you can understand it very well, and selfish genes and what have you, but it's still not a good idea. And we say, well, okay, but this is wrong. So we have to be very careful here. Just because something is something that belongs to our nature, and same way I say philandering, it's, of course, men may feel that way, and then we are making serious attempt to come to grip with those persons and to behave properly. So I just wanted to make this clear, that just because something is ingrained doesn't give it a normative status.
Well, that's right. So, some stuff we should follow, some things we should push back against. It just depends on each of them individually. Another thing about your discussion of folk economics is this idea of a fixed pie, a zero-sum game, that all economic exchanges are, if I gain, somebody else is probably losing. And I think in our evolutionary past, that was probably mostly true. I mean, it was a fixed pie. There wasn't that much stuff to go around. So an equal splitting of the food of the particular hunt success was pretty critical, that it be reasonably fair. So therefore, any asymmetries of that, probably are disruptive to the group and should be punished.
I think there was no opportunity for growth. The way things were, there was no growth, I believe. Whereas now we have turned our collective minds in various ways to generate growth. And in fact, we very often consider this as being the main goal, but the main way of improving things. And then the tension between equality and progress exists often. And we've seen that in the recent history. We see it even today in all kind of partisan or the ideological discussions. But it's the fact that economists are typically focused on growth, whereas lay people tend to focus on equality. And the reason for that may well be just what you alluded to, because at the time there was no alternative. There was only equality and fairness. I would also say something else, though. Recent studies, in particular, I'm thinking of Paul Bloom of Yale, suggest that, or indicate, would be stronger, that people don't care so much about inequality as they do about unfairness. Mm-hmm. Fairness is paramount. And then it becomes a very vexed question of determining what is or what is not fair, especially in the modern economy. It used to be that, okay, if you work hard your field and then you have a better crop, well, okay, fair enough. I mean, you've been working so hard and I had a good time and I have enough, but okay, fair enough. In the modern economy, money accrues to people in function of the demand. For example, every I don't know, say, second computer has Windows on it. Well, then Microsoft gets filthy rich. Now, just notice the term filthy. There's nothing filthy about it. They become very rich because all those people want it. Or say you are a great singer and you manage to sell your songs to multitudes. Well, then you become very rich. Is it fair? Well, nowadays, that can happen. And you have people who become extremely rich, and it's totally it's not proportional to the effort they put into it, but it comes from their having found or even created a niche where they can get lots of money. So the question about fairness gets very difficult because we tend to approach it in terms that are really not very appropriate to the current situation. To my mind, this is a very good example of where public policy, the discussion should be what is the good for the public, and not is it fair or not. Because I mean, you haven't worked more for the 10,000 first buyers of your song than you did for the 10 million because it was a runaway success. So you shouldn't get any money, but more money. That's not the question anymore. The question has to be, given that a country has so much money, what would be the best, leaving it very open for a moment, what would be the best, most appropriate way of distributing it? And that's really a very good question.
Yeah.
And a question that we shouldn't approach, I was alluding to that before, I don't think we should approach it using those tools that we happen to have from our forebears. We should think what is really best. And as in all value questions, there will be many possible arguments, and people will typically select those arguments that benefit themselves under the guise of being objective and neutral. But in fact, people tend to, as we know always, people have what you call motivated thinking. People try to bring arguments that support their own economic things. And here is where we get in the States, but not only in the States. In the States, it's very sharp. But you see it many places where you have those big ideological arguments. And the people are not really well equipped to think those things through. And in particular, I believe a serious problem with all of that is that people have not developed a good enough appreciation of complexity. Typically, you have people having one view, and then they try to destroy the opposite ones, even the plural. Whereas the proper way of educating our students would be to say, okay, there is something to be said about various views, and now let's try to think of the best way, but of combining them, of finding a compromise, of considering all of them at the same time. But there's absolutely no reason, just because my point is true, to determine that yours would be wrong.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp things like economic growth and what it means to have an economy growing at 2% versus 3%. To the average person, that doesn't sound like much, but to an economist, that's a third more growth. That's a lot. And or the analogy I make with that fixed pie intuition we have, if so-and-so has twice as much as me, that means I have half as much as him, and I'm getting a smaller pie that feels unfair. Let's say I own 1,000 shares of Apple computer stock and it goes up $10. I just made $10,000. That feels pretty good. But then I see someone like Elon Musk has 100,000 shares and he just made $1 million in the same day that I made $10,000. And all of a sudden that doesn't feel so right. But to overcome that, I have to think, well, of course, the day it goes down $10, he just lost $1 million and I only lost 10,000. But that takes an extra step of cognition. Like I have to think about this. It's not a fixed pie. It's not like he gets more, so I get less. It's a much more complex economic idea.
And it's not only economic. My point will always try in this conversation to bring it to psychology. And really, the question is whether we compare wealth or whether we compare status. Now, wealth is indeed not a fixed sum or zero-sum game. And as you say, you may be making a killing on Wall Street, and I did very nicely, thank you. And then I compare to you. Well, why do I have to compare to you? I mean, you made a lot of money. You should be. I'm very happy for you. You did very well, and then I'm quite happy for me because I did all right. But status is what economists call positional goods. That is, we can't all be the first, and we can't all be the second. And if you passed me, then then I am behind you now, and I compare. And part of the thing is that psychologically we tend to compare. Actually, we don't really compare when things. There have been some interesting discussion about whether inequality does or does not make people unhappy. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting because for a long time, the thinking was that yes, it does. Seeing other people making more money makes people who have less happy. The more recent thinking, I would say, in the last few years, but based on very good data, suggests that this is not the case. That in fact, we get used to everything. So, I mean, upstairs, downstairs, television series. Well, people who were downstairs were very accepting of the fact that they just are not an earl or something, and that's the way it is. And then everybody has to know his rank and so forth. So people, it seems, are not very upset by the fact of the change. What happened was when disparity changes, in particular, of course, when it increases. And in Western societies and also in China, there has been a huge increase in the gap. And that's when people start asking questions. Another thing is also that if you look at it correlationally, in places like China, for example, it's true that there has been a huge increase in disparity, but at the same time, you don't see an increase in unhappiness. The reason being that many people, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people, were living at near subsistence levels. Yeah, they were dirt poor, dirt in all the sense of the term. They just were hoping every year that there would be enough of a crop to surplus to be able to sow next year and so forth. And then when people moved to the city, and good numbers of them made well by moving to the city because there were salaries to be paid, and they entered the market economy, different type of thing, and did much better. So those people now really felt that they went forward, and the other people don't feel bad. So it's a difficult thing to say whether inequality by itself is an issue. During changes of equality, then certainly people ask questions. And then there's another perspective to look at it. And it is, as we know, there's a diminishing return in money. That is, if you give a poor student $1,000, he'll be quite happy. If you or me receive another $1,000, well, it's nice to have, of course, but it doesn't make us nearly as happy. So if the state, as a state, has $1,000, you buy more happiness by giving it to the poorest people in society than to the richest people of society. And that's another type of argument for a more aggressive distribution, or at least limiting that spread that is now developing.
Yeah, I think it's important to decouple. Sorry. I think it's important to decouple happiness from life satisfaction or quality of life. I mean, a lot of things we do don't make us happy, but they lead to a more fulfilling life, just challenges in life, or having children, or starting businesses, or taking up a difficult sport, or something that isn't fun to do all the time. You're not sitting there glowing like you just, took some happy pills, but down the road, in the long run, it leads to a more fulfilling life. So here, I think money, at some point, it may not make you happier after, whatever, 100,000 a year, or whatever the number is these days. But it gives you more opportunities to do things that lead to a more fulfilling life. Let's say you can take more trips, or you can fund some charities that you support, or you can start a business. And one of the reasons I never liked that original research that money doesn't make people happier, because I thought that could be used by conservatives to tell poor people, you just be happy down there at your station, because look, I'm not getting any happier living in this 20 bedroom mansion. Well, that's bullshit. Of course, he's got a better life because there's so many more opportunities that money provides. So I was glad to see that decoupled. Psychologically, I think we don't want to think of just money and happiness as the only parameter we want to look at there. And
I totally agree. I would just say another thing, though, is to factor in is that one thing that you do with money is that it can buffer you for life's hard knocks.
Yeah.
If now, interesting, I organized it last year, I believe, an international conference in Israel, and there was Alessi, a well-known Dutch economist, and he said, really, the way the things are set up in Holland, you don't really need to have money aside for in case something bad hits you, because it's all taken care of already.
Right.
And the money was already taken from your income in the past, but now if suddenly you should have a sick child, or your house burned down or something, all the major or the need of old age care, or illnesses, whatever, those things are already factored in, and therefore you having more money in those places will already have less of an impact, because it doesn't serve the function of protecting you in case of serious difficulties.
Yeah, I think one of the burdens of poverty is just constantly worrying about where you're going to get enough money to pay the bills at the end of the month, or make your mortgage or your rent, or pay your utilities. For me, when I got to the point in my life when I didn't have to think about it anymore, like I never made a budget. I always made just enough more than I really needed, with a little bit of cushion if a few things went wrong. It wasn't catastrophic. To me, that was freedom. I could just quit thinking about it and just write my books or ride my bike or whatever it is I was doing. And so it wasn't the amount of money. It was having just a little bit of a cushion more than I needed. And so this gets that hedonic treadmill you mentioned earlier, that the critics of that if you're constantly needing more, you're never going to have that cushion, because you're always going to want to be spending slightly more than you're making, and you're always going to be on the knife edge there. And there I can see a point of always chasing the bigger McMansion, or always wanting the bigger car or something. So there's a virtue in not wanting stuff that you really can't afford anyway. That is sort of liking your position without having to worry about the basics of life.
much of happiness depends really on, philosophers and religious thinkers over the centuries have all come to the same conclusion, of course, that you cannot get everything and you shouldn't want to. And in fact, if you are healthy in your head, then you don't really want to. That's something else. But that's why I specifically brought up the issue of protecting you against serious mishaps.
This is the coming up in the 2020 election here in America. Bernie Sanders and some of the other liberals really are pushing for something like a universal basic income or universal health care, some kind of system that, because we have so much wealth, we really could afford it. I mean, if countries like Germany can afford it and still have a prosperous economy, a universal health care, for example, and child care and maternity leave and these sorts of things that are still being fought over in America. In Germany, they're just granted and they don't seem to suffer. Why can't we do that? I mean, that's kind of what you're getting at there. Psychologically, you want to bring up everybody to a certain level so that the ups and downs are buffered, and from there let the freedom and free market or what people do whatever they want.
It's really very cultural. I can give you very easily many examples. As we all know, the American system is extremely individualistic, and each person has to find his way, her way in life, and making money and making choices and so forth. And to give you just a simple example, in Israel, we have already a number of years now, you have a mandatory retirement savings. Nobody's asking you. You have a salary. It used to be until a few years ago, if you have a salary, then the employer has to set aside a certain sum to the
matching program.
Yeah, but it's fairly high, and even your part is being taken. I mean, you just never see that money. It just is being set in Israel. The way it functions is it something like a 401k that you have in the States, and then at a certain point, then it was also decided that independents have two. There was some arguments why you shouldn't have independence, and then at some point the Ministry of Finance says, okay, that's enough. People don't save money enough, and they need that money, and we pass a law. Now, in the United States, people agonize about that. I mean, this is paternalism, which is perceived as a very wrong thing. Mm-hmm. And then you have people like Thaler, who just got a Nobel Prize, and Sustein, who says, okay, we can have a sort of middle way. We nudge people so we don't quite force them. And well, in Israel, you just say, no, this is the law of the land. Now you have to put money aside because you don't do it otherwise. And in Israel, it's not that on political issues, people are very divided, but people seem to be quite happy because I ran a national sample on that question. No, many questions about pension, but in particular, I asked the question, well, in Israel, we have to set aside money for pension, and the government decides how much it is. And what do you think about it? Well, everybody basically said either it's a great idea, it's a good idea, or it's an excellent idea. And then a few people, well, they were a little more middling, but nobody apparently, very few people had any opposition to it. And I believe, okay, you do get to say where that money is going to be invested. There are special funds that are being set up. But I'm just saying that my general point here is it's cultural. In the United States, it's totally unthinkable that a law like that would pass. Everybody would be up in arms. Even people who think that it's very important and realize how bad it is would still try to water it down because surely the government cannot decide for people. So it's cultural. And okay, I think every culture is entitled to its own decision. So when you ask, why can't we do it the way they do it in Germany? The answer says, well, economically you could, of course. I mean, you are not a poor country than Germany or than Israel for that matter. But you cannot do it. And in France, things are like that are also rather difficult because the French are amongst the most suspicious citizens in the world. You may not know that, but it's a fact. They are extremely suspicious of government, always, and they'll block most every initiative that's being taken. And then there are all kinds of things that are politically infeasible. And if they are politically infeasible, it doesn't matter whether it works very well elsewhere, because the point is it won't work right here.
Yeah. Well, that gets to the subject of income inequality. Again, there's an intuition that a certain amount over, let's say, the base workers' pay that the CEO makes seems okay, 10 times, 20 times as much. And that was always kind of acceptable in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But in the 90s, when it creeped up to like 100 times more, 500 times more, 1,000 times more than the average worker's pay, at some point there was a tipping point where pretty much everybody said, you know what, that's just not right. I mean, what is the psychology of that? That there's some number that you hit.
I don't. Well, yes. If you ask the psychology, I can put it very broadly. We are not sensitive to things. We are sensitive to changes in things. That's true for everything. If you are sitting now with your back against the chair, there is a little pressure there. Until I mention it, I'm sure you were totally unaware of it. If it started pressing a little stronger because, I don't know, some spring is broken behind that, and my chair is beginning to push me slightly, I won't feel it. When you start pushing it more or faster, then I say, well, what goes on? And then I have to check what's happening. When we were talking, you were mentioning and I mentioned in different way the hedonic treadmill. Inequality per se is not as aversive, apparently, because you don't pay attention to it. Of course, when attention is drawn to it, you may say, well, but why really? How come that those masters have that money and we servants don't have any? But you don't think about it. That's just the way life is. My son, you should just accept it. But when things start changing, that's when people start asking questions. And it's good that they're asking questions. And it's true that the answer then should not be, well, it's fair, it's not unfair, but it is, let's think of what we believe is the best project for our society. What would be the best way of doing it? One way would be to say, let's maximize happiness. Another one, which I'd rather like, is to say, let's begin by the bottom, people at the bottom. Both because, as I mentioned, it's more efficient, but that's more of an economist trick. They like efficiency. But as a human being, you'd say, some people really suffer. If we can remove their suffering, well, surely that's more important than mildly improving the life of everybody else. So let's concentrate on those. But okay, that's just me as a personal perspective. The general point is we have to think how we want our society what our society should look like. We had a sort of clarion call. What's going on here? Those people are getting so rich and they pump all the money. I don't have any less, but still something is happening there. Okay, the opportunity is not saying, well, that's not fair. Let's stop it. But say, how do we best manage it? And like a pre-election campaign is a good opportunity to try to discuss it sensibly. That's when you change the government if you have to, or you want to, and then you can implement what you want.
Yeah, my friend John Mackey, who's the CEO of Whole Foods, which is a supermarket chain in the United States, it was just purchased by Amazon. So he's good friends with Jeff Bezos, and John Mackey has a book called Conscious Capitalism. So he's a big free market libertarian, Ayn Rand, competition is great and all that stuff. But he's also kind of a hippie, vegan, loves hiking. He dresses very modestly, and you never know he was super rich. And so he just arbitrarily set the maximum number is 19 times that the CEO of Whole Foods can make more than the average worker's pay. And that seemed pretty acceptable to his employees. And he's got a whole argument about taking care of the stakeholders in a business, which is not just your investors and your stockholders, but also your employees, but also the environment, the neighborhood that you're in, the people that are around there. So Whole Foods gives away a lot of free food to homeless people in the communities that they're in, that sort of thing. And also then the environment, like you should invest in clean air and water and that sort of thing. So he gets a lot of cred among liberals for, caring about the environment, caring about poor people, and also capping that CEO factor at 19. And that does kind of feel, there's something, again, intuitively psychological about 100 times is too high, 10 times is maybe a little low, 20 times, yeah, okay, that seems about right. I have no idea why that is, but psychologically.
You're asking here, but it's interesting because you're asking here or discussing here income. but not wealth.
Yes.
Now, it's an interesting question because, of course, in capitalism, wealth is the prime source of income.
Yeah.
And when you test how people view the ideal distribution of wealth and compare it, on the one hand, to what they believe to be the present distribution of wealth, and on the other hand, to the actual distribution of wealth in the United States, you have a very interesting result that was found by Norton and Dan Ariely, well known, and they showed that there was very little difference between Republican and Democrats. Everybody seemed to want a more egalitarian distribution of wealth. Everybody, than what they thought to be the case, but what they thought was the case was way, way, way more egalitarian than the actual state of affairs. Which really means that when you look now, you don't focus, as we just did now, on income, but when you look also, you look at wealth, which is, I think, the more important bit, everybody thinks that the present situation is not what it should be. Now, if we are talking in terms of how society should structure itself, arrange itself, well, then that's something to be taken into account. Not because you happen to feel your chair pushing you in your back, or because the things went up very quickly, but it's okay, here's an opportunity to think, because I never realized the distribution was so skewed. That's something that, as a society, we should try to change, because, as I said, we can at least help the poorest people who really suffer to get out of that poverty.
Yeah, let's drill down on that a bit more, on the difference between income and wealth. In the United States, there's a distinct difference between black and white average incomes, but it's not super substantial. But it is substantial in terms of wealth, just owning homes, owning cars, the kind of stuff you can accumulate in a lifetime, such that when you retire, you don't have to have the income because you have wealth that builds on itself. That is pretty dramatic, black-white difference in America. Again, this is coming up in the 2020 election. What are we going to do about this disparity? So let's just talk about that a little bit, the psychology of having wealth versus income.
Here, I'm afraid I don't have too much to say. The one thing I would say, though, is about accumulation of wealth and why people care about it. You know, we have those characters, Smoke, the dragon, or what was it called? A Donald Duck character, Scrooge, was it? Scrooge McDuck, I believe.
Yeah.
Who lived in, I don't know, 50 cubic acres of money, I don't know, the whole thing. And he just enjoyed having the money. And there's something terribly mistaken about the notion that sitting literally on a pile of money or of gold, that imaginary, does anybody any good. And that's an interesting point, because I think you might connect a bit to the trade wars that we hear now about between the United States and China and those new developments. The idea that, well, it's better to export because that way we'll have plenty of money, we'll have plenty of gold, we'll have. Trump has recently a sentence about, likely, I believe it was, about billions of dollars are pouring into the coffers of the United States. And that's something that relates more to my book, because it bespeaks a misunderstanding about the role of money in the economic world. It was the idea of the mercantilist in the 17th century, I think it was, where they said, well, we should really try to sell, and then people will buy, and then we'll have plenty of money and we'll be so rich, which is totally wrong-headed. Not everything they said was wrong-headed, because they had the power of the gunships of Britain to force people to trade at very advantageous condition for the British. But by itself, that claim by itself is meaningless. The point of trade is always mutually beneficial unless you have gunships behind you. If you are willing to buy something, some goods from me, and in return you give me some service, well, I'm better off and you're better off. If we weren't both better off, then we would have no deal. Fundamentally, that's what it boils down to. Because you can maybe provide that service cheaper than I can do it on myself, and I can produce more of that good because I'm already doing so much, or another 10% isn't a big deal. And then you can get to enjoy that extra 10%, and everybody is happy. So when I think about the trade war today, then you really have to look at it at two levels: at the level of individual transactions, and those are by definition beneficial for both sides, because otherwise they would not engage. If I buy something at AliExpress, well, they're happy to sell it to me at that price. I'm happy to buy it at the price, and therefore good all around. But then you have another aspect, which is what we started off with: the integration of all those individual moves, and those modify greatly the economic landscape. Ultimately, this comes down, and I believe Trump has a point there, who is going to be the top dog in 25 years, say? Who is going to be the major economic power? Now, it is perfectly possible to fight it out, because that whole aspect of how do we structure the whole thing is basically a form of diplomacy. The Americans, taking it as a collective, try to get the best they can for themselves, and the Chinese do too, and that's perfectly fine. And then they are trying to fight it, trying to bring it down in terms of, well, they are fair or not fair, they are cheating, they are not cheating, I believe is totally inappropriate. And also, in order to do it right, you have to really understand economics deeply, because those shifts in trade patterns have many consequences. Just to give one that also has been in the news in the States, from what I read, what happens to the dollar? Is the dollar stronger or weaker? Does it mean that it's easier to export or to import? And you have many other aspects that are exactly those aggregate effects that go way beyond the individual ones. And these are the ones that can affect the outcome, how good the outcome of a trade fight, they call it, or trade, I think you might call it renegotiation. How good the effects will be for everybody. And here, it certainly doesn't have to be a zero sum. On the contrary, perfectly possible that both countries will be prosperous, and therefore Americans will be able to sell a lot to Chinese because they'll be richer, and conversely, and good all around. And all those poor people in the countryside in China will be able to work in factories and make money and a decent living, and everybody would be happy. So what I feel about this whole topic is that, starting from a very elementary, and in this case, misunderstanding of what trade really is like, you should really move to an understanding of the economy as a system, which requires a great deal of economic knowledge, basically, understanding and knowledge. And then it doesn't have to be at all a winner and a loser. That whole concept of winners and losers.
Well, that's that economic nationalism, which is really just mercantilism, going back to the 18th century, as a zero-sum pie. If China gets this much more than then that means we get that much less than them. But I was going to say, from a consumer's point of view, okay, let's say I have my iPhone here. What do I care where it's made? If it's made in China and it costs me $500, but if Apple made this in California, it would probably be $1,000. So I'm glad that they make it in China. What do I care? But then Trump says, oh, well, China's cheating us and China's getting ahead, so we got to put a tariff on them. And it's a 10% tariff, so now the iPhone is $50 more than it would be. But Apple doesn't pay that tariff. I do. The customers pay that.
Honestly, that's something that I don't understand, why Trump keeps saying that over and over again, that we are imposing, the Chinese are paying us being the Americans, all those billions. Everybody knows that that's not the case. And I don't really understand why he keeps saying that, because I can't believe he doesn't, well, he must have been told by many that this isn't the way things work. So I don't know. There's something about his way of talking and of communicating that seems to be working very well for him politically. But I don't understand. Also, I don't feel comfortable criticizing the president of a different country.
Yeah.
It's true. I don't.
Well, the other part in your, just kind of going through the major topics in your book of Economic Misunderstanding, the difference between liberals and conservatives and how they think about the economy. You had some psychological studies there on how liberals see the world and human nature versus how conservatives see the world and human nature, and how that affects our understanding of the economy.
There are many items there that one could discuss. One part of it goes back to merit. It's a concept that needs a little elucidation. We can't do it now. But when the discussion goes about, well, you see somebody who is unemployed, whose fault is it? The conservatives' view would say, well, somewhere it's his fault. That person did not study right in school or did not exert himself enough or whatever.
Right.
And the standard liberal approach would be to say, well, the society, I mean, he didn't have a good role models and he lived in didn't have good teachers and what have you, and therefore things are not working out very well. Now, a deeper tension around here goes about, is it or is it not the case then in, say, in the United States that merit will get you ahead? If you believe that this is not the case, then you can't very well blame people. And that's an interesting question, because it turns out that rather than people's view about the case of the matter is terribly influenced by ideology.
Yeah.
And that ideology, I see it as being sort of a crutch. Since you don't understand economics because it's so difficult, then there are various ways that you can use to try to have an opinion all the same, because you seem to be required to have, nowadays you are supposed to have an opinion, be it only for voting, but even in just everyday conversation, people have views and you should have one too. So what basically happens is that people subscribe to an ideology, and then they embrace everything that goes with it. There's very little thinking that goes on. In a way, it's understandable, because thinking about those matters is, well, it requires a great deal of effort and of knowledge and devotion, and who wants to do that? So basically what you have there is, you say, okay, I'll just, it used to be that I'll ask the priest and the priest will tell me what's what, or maybe my father, he knows everything when you're a child, and then, you say, okay, well, I'll look my favorite news outlet or Twitter and what have you, and then I'll know what I believe. But there is a fact of the matter. Is or is not, are the United States or not a meritocracy? People don't really want to know that, because it might upset their perspective, and people will function that way. So that's one important thing that I want to say in the general perspective, is that the book sets out in great detail all the ways in which people have fundamentally little chance of understanding economics. And then they have various ways of coming to grips with that situation. And one of them is by embracing an ideology which sort of substitute. Another way, by the way, I don't know whether you wanted to discuss it, but I might bring it up, is your personality.
Yeah.
I have a great study where we ask people, do you think that the economy is stable or unstable or in danger of crashing? And people say what they say. But then we also ask the same people, well, do you think that personal relationship, you're with a girlfriend and life is wonderful or not? And then as the Beatles, yesterday came suddenly. Why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say. all of a sudden, everything breaks down. And I like that song because we hear what the guy thinks, what the girl thinks about
Right,
it.
of course.
So she would have something
He
to
had
add
her
to it.
reasons.
She certainly had good reasons, and I'm not sure he wants to hear them. But in any event, going back to that, whether you think that personal relationships are a danger of collapsing or personal health, you feel fine, but maybe tomorrow you'll find out some terrible thing happened to you. Well, turns out those things are very correlated. So ultimately, when you think about it, when people say, I believe that the economy is fairly stable, they seem to be talking about the economy as though they knew something. What they really are expressing is whether they are stressed out people or not. Because if you believe it turns out that if you believe that the economy is in danger, you believe that also, personal relationships are unstable and the climate will collapse and health is dangerous and everything is bad.
Yeah.
That's the that's another way we have to manage to, at the same time, feel in control, feeling that we have an opinion, we can answer something, even though we don't know.
Yeah, it's like the behavior genetics research on twins separated from birth or raised in separate environments, and then the control against twins raised in the same environment, and so on. Anyway, when you look at the behavior genetics research on personality and temperament, at least half of it is genetic. It's inherited. So as I like to say, if conservatives like to say, well, I get up in the morning early and I'm full of vim and vigor and I want to go out and work and make my mark in the world and so on. Well, at least half of that is genetic, because there's a lot of people that don't wake up in the morning feeling like they want to go out full of energy and work hard and so on. And that's not a choice that they make in as much as temperament like happiness. Some people are always bubbly and happy and others are always grumpy, and that's at least half genetic. So to the extent that conservatives have this just world view of the world, just world theory,
Believe in a just world.
Yeah. They have some points that I listen to them. I go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yes, hard work, responsibility, saving, don't live a profligate life, and so forth. Yes, those all matter, but to a certain extent, your parents raised you to be that way. You didn't choose that. Your genetics contributed to that. Your peer group, your mentors, all these things that you sort of stumble along in life. Which is why when Obama gave that famous speech that conservatives' heads exploded when he said, you didn't make that, that when you built that company, you had employees that the government educated at public schools, and you transported your goods on public roads, and you have a police force and a military force and a stable economy. We did all that, the government. And, he has a point. That's also true. And, so I can kind of see both arguments, both liberals and conservatives. I think part of the problem is it's not a binary choice. Either the world is just and fair and everybody gets their just desserts, or it's completely rigged. It's both, there's a certain extent of both, and which is what
that really goes. Yes, well, that goes back to what I was saying. What we need to cultivate in ourselves and teach it to others is an appreciation for complexity. As you say, it's not either or. It's really both. If you have 50% personality, then you have 50% that's not personality. If you have 20% is what you did and 80% the government, then they are 20% and 80%. They both are there. Don't knock the other side.
Yeah, so this is why I'm open to the idea of a UBI, a universal basic income of some kind. Although I suppose you'd have to get rid of other social programs that are already taking up so much of the budget. About 20% of the budget of most modern industrial democracies is for social spending. 20% of GDP per year. Canada, the United States, most of the European countries, and so on. And the United States is about in the middle there. If you added a UBI where everybody gets, say, $1,000 a month, that's got to come from somewhere, probably in these other social spending programs. But the point is it's not like everybody who gets welfare, Social Security of some kind, or food stamps or whatever, they're not all welfare queens scamming the system, although there is a lot of corruption and scamming going on. So, it's like there's some balance to be had there, as well as with private charity too.
I believe all of those forms of redistributions have to be carefully analyzed for what they promote, what they discourage. And the way things are set up in the United States now is a bit haphazard. I recently heard there's a economic festival called in Trento in Italy, and the major keynote was given by an American economist, Hillary Haley, and she made a very good point. But she showed several programs, and she said, well, some programs are to help people at that stage, but it has to be phased off as soon as people earn more than that amount, because otherwise then they will not try to look for work. And other benefits are for people who had the mishap of losing their job and something else has to happen. And other things are for people who cannot possibly earn money because they are those kinds of people who suffer from whatever they suffer. And the way the things is set up in the United States at the present is not, I believe I don't betray her basic idea, it's not thought through. You can design programs not as an expression of your wanting to do good, but you have to do it advisedly. And economists can help a great deal in designing those things very carefully. The one real problem here, related to my general point, is that because the public does not understand those issues at all, it's difficult to promote public policy in that way. It's much easier to give to have a good soundbite, which, if implemented literally, will be a total catastrophe. Will not reach its aims, and it will have all kinds of unintended consequences. There are so many cases. Let me give you an example of the unintended consequences. We had in Jerusalem, and I heard Kamala Harris, prominent Democratic candidate, wanting, well, I'll take Harris' case because it's in the United States. Well, I'll first take the one in Jerusalem. They wanted to draw students to the center of town, which was a bit sort of too quiet in the evening. And they said, okay, what we'll do is we will provide money. We'll give a stipend to the students if they move to the center of town, because they can't afford it, it's too expensive, but we'll give them more money, then they'll get there, and then there'll be cafe and life, and people will enjoy it, and the center of town will be revived. Well, what do you think happened? There's the same supply, but more demand, and prices shot up. Ultimately, did not manage to draw more students there. Prices went higher, and even those people who were already living there, well, it was now priced beyond their means, so that people actually left. The only people who earned money there were the landlords. Now, I don't have anything about the landlords, but as a policy, this was totally stupid. I mean, city money was spent for a purpose that any first-year economic student would say, well, supply, demand, those things have some kind of a relationship. You can't do that. But now Harris has a similar idea, because in your area, actually, I believe in Los Angeles, but I believe she wants it nationally, prices are very high. You know about that more than I would, but prices are terribly high. Rentals are terribly high in the San Francisco area.
So we have rent control,
Okay, and then the idea is, well, let the government pay. Nobody should be paying more than 1/3 of their income for rentals. She called that the Affordable Rent Act or some such. And then the government will just pitch in whatever is required. It doesn't need a Nobel Prize in economics to understand that if take me, I come to live in Los Angeles, I'll rent a beautiful mansion. It will be way beyond 1/3 of my income, and then the government will pay for my money.
Right.
There are obvious consequences that will happen.
Right.
And the difficulty with that is that too many in the States, for example, what it means is that too many of the people who make decisions or suggest votes and the like are not economists, but lawyers. And also they want to be elected. There's this beautiful quote from Jean-Claude Juncker, who was the president of the European Commission, who said, we know what we should be doing, we don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it.
Right. Well, this brings up another hot button topic now is minimum wage. You know, the liberal argument is that if you work a full-time job, you should have a livable wage. You shouldn't have to work more than a full-time job, especially if you have kids. So, $15 an hour. Now, the conservative response to that is that, but if McDonald's hires 2 people at $15 an hour, that's $30 an hour. They could hire 3 people at $10 an hour and therefore open up more economic opportunities for young people. See, here conservatives are usually thinking of like teenagers living at home with their parents, getting their first job at $10 an hour. That's not so bad. If you're a 45-year-old single mom, working a full-time job at McDonald's, $10 an hour is not going to cut it for you. So it depends on who you're talking about. But economists on the conservative side say, well, this actually hurts employment of younger people, and it's not having the effect that liberals want it to have.
I know that they came out about 2 years ago, 2018, 17, I believe. There was a very good study done in Seattle. You may have heard of it. It was in Seattle, they introduced a minimum wage only for Seattle, which is a bit special, but very useful analytically, because then you can compare. They did a really careful job of finding appropriate places where that law did not apply, but that were otherwise very similar, and therefore you can compare what happened. And also what's very nice is that they got their hands of a lot of data, including not only what the average wage was, the hourly wage was, how many hours everybody was working and where they were working. Actually, it was the city that commissioned that study, I believe. In any event, they were extremely well equipped with data. And the conclusions in this particular case, but it's the best study apparently we have, because it's not only about restaurants, it's about everything. The conclusion there was that it does cause a lot of problem, not only because jobs get lost. I'll take an example of the restaurant, but it definitely is not only about the restaurant. If you have a restaurant, and in that restaurant, you had people very lowly paid who would clean tables and cut vegetables and do other low entry-level jobs. Well, you may find out that by buying and flying in cut vegetable from Mexico, it gets much cheaper. Well, it was okay to hire the local kid, but once the prices went up, they say, okay, well, then it's cheaper. And then this has all kinds of cascading effect. One of them is that other places find out that you can get it cheaper by flying it from Mexico. And then in Mexico, you have that factories that are growing and selling it. You may begin, for example, if it's not an expensive restaurant, you may ask your patrons to go and take their trail and put it wherever it was, and then you don't need that person anymore, just cleaning the table, but you don't need to take it off and whatever. And then, once people are used to that, then you don't need those people anymore. And the consequences are in various ways. One is that it's spread geographically, and the other is that you have lost the bottom rung of the ladder, mm-hmm. the entry level jobs,
right?
Because other people who were good workers did okay, and then they were promoted and did some more significant work because they were being paid. But those young kids, it was a problem because they need to, they are young and they are not very responsible, and then they decide on Friday to tell you, okay, boss, Friday, if you're not going to give me Saturday off, I want to see my girlfriend, bye-bye, I'm leaving, I'm quitting. They need to be trained and form and understand that, okay, it's a mutual agreement, you can't just go and leave like that, and so forth, and so forth. The outcome from the study is that in many respects, this was not a good idea. But I believe the important point here, beyond that specific issue that you raised, because it's valuable in itself, and I wouldn't trust my reading as being covering everything, but I do read that stuff. But more importantly is that you cannot just go by your heart here, because you say, oh, it's not fair to this, or it's important to that. You really have to see nobody saw all of those consequences coming. You really have to be looking for them and studying them and seeing whether they are of great magnitude or not. You have to run the experiment, and then maybe you have to run the experiment in various places, and then you know more. And
yeah, you have this cartoon in the book of the law of unintended consequences. So it's an image of Jesus here, and he says, "Give all that you have to the poor." And then 5 years later, so how'd it go? Well, we did as you said and gave our food to the poor for free, but that caused the poor's domestic agriculture industry to collapse. We ran out of food, so we gave them our clothes so they wouldn't freeze in the winter. Okay, that collapsed the poor's clothing industry. So now everyone's starving and naked and actually probably eating each other to live. So we were hoping you had some miraculous way to transmute good intentions into good results. And then Jesus says, I could make some free fish or bread. And then the guy says, nope, tried that. Didn't work. We need something more sustainable. And lo and behold, the Lord spake, saying, behold, these fish shall be sold at the appropriate market value. In other words, and this was Hayek's point about money as a form of information, that it's a constant, always real-time updated across 10,000 industries, across 100,000 transactions in each of those 10,000 industries. And nobody can know all of that information except just you and I in our little corner, just making our trades and then bargaining. And that's what determines the real value of labor.
I believe that there are 2 points here. One is that absolutely signals are terribly important, and that's the way of finding it. And sometimes things that seem unpalatable ultimately are really all to the good. For example, an example I give in the book, a classic example, is after a hurricane, then prices of all kinds of things go up, and that you may say, well, it's so unfair. Just when people need it most, they charge more. But the point is also, not the point, the outcome is that since people charge more, then contractors from all over the country, or at least a broader area, will bring in those supplies because it's worth their while, and therefore ultimately you'll have all the material you need there, or workers, or what have you. At the same time, when we talk about the invisible hand, it being precisely not purposeful, it has no goal in life, then the visible hand can as well be for the bad as for the good. And we cannot just assume, just because that's the proper market value, doesn't mean that this should be the price, the going price. Maybe that's the market value, and we are unhappy with that going price, and we'll subsidize it if we can bring good reason for that. Some people call that meddling and interfering with the market, as though the market was some kind of a heaven-given wisdom. Or you can say, no, this is the way those things have to work. You have to see where it's going, and then you can decide whether you're willing to put the money that it requires to solve whatever problem happened there. I mean, that's an important point, because that ideological discussion between right and left, whether, well, the market is always right, versus no, the government is part of, and the government is part of the problem. Government may or may not be part of the solution. You really have to be, I use that word again, I find that humble. You have to look at what the data really says. And if you think that the minimum wage is what it is, then you really have to think about whether you want to intervene. And if you do want to intervene, you have to be very careful about what consequences will be. And then you may even decide, okay, I am willing to bear those consequences. Same way when you go to war, you know there'll be some damage, and you still think that overall, that's what we want. That's what we really want our representatives to think about, not to brandish a pre-made ideological statement, but every issue is a specific issue. Just like in art, every beautiful piece of art is a singular piece of work. It's not generic. Right. The same holds for every important policy decision.
I have to say, as a tribute to your writing, and maybe you're thinking, I could not tell after reading your book whether you're a liberal or conservative or what.
I want to tell you that I tell that my students when I begin my class. I say I don't want to get into a discussion with you. Whenever you bring something, I'll take a meta position discussing it, because I think that's the way we learn the most. Also, I believe, the what do you call them, the hedgehogs and the foxes.
Right.
Yep,
Isaiah
just
Berlin.
for the heroes who don't know it. Hedgehogs are those people who know one thing. They have a clear ideological view and they stick to it. And then the foxes know many things. That goes back to a Greek poem, but I don't know the Greek. And I just mentioned a thing. I'm entirely an extreme fox. And I have no ideology. It's not that I don't have principles. I have the principle that you have to judge everything on a case-by-case basis. So you will not manage to pigeonhole me, not because I'm hiding it, because I'm all over the place. On each issue, I try to think and to find the most appropriate response.
Well, David, we've been going well over an hour. I want to be mindful of your time. I know it's evening there in Israel, but I wanted to ask you about one more thing, since you're in Israel and you're Jewish, and the subject of reparations paid by Germany for the Holocaust has come up recently in the United States, because we're back into the reparations for slavery debate here. And that's one of the analogies that's used. Look, Germany has paid Israel and Jews for the harm that they did in the 1940s and in the World War II and the Holocaust. Why shouldn't we pay reparations to African Americans and so on? What are your thoughts on the economics and psychology of paying reparations, assuming that it's all legitimate, that the harm is real, and there's some apologies and maybe more than that are really should be made?
That's a difficult one. Americans are very big on admitting mistakes publicly as being an important cleansing activity. People who did well, who did badly, are required to publicly admit their faults. I think I don't know that it's international. It's very much American. You are asking about material reparation.
Yeah.
The only good model I know is what happened in South Africa under Mandela, where it was less a matter of I believe economically is one thing, reparation is I don't know whether it can be done, but okay, basically I have very little to contribute to that debate. You also caught me a bit by surprise. I would have to really think about it. No, but I believe that's the right answer. And when students ask me things, I say, well, put it in writing. Let me think about it. I don't think that I should have an answer to everything you say. I think I want to give you a good answer to what you say.
Well, maybe that's your next book, because it is a hard question. Well, the counter to the analog of Germany paying Israel for reparations for the Holocaust is these people are still alive. When the reparations started, the perpetrators and victims.
On both sides, exactly.
On both sides, yeah. But there's no one alive now that has anything to do with slavery, one way or the other. So it feels too distant. And also the other part about it.
I can think that it's really interesting when you mention the Holocaust, because you don't really think about it. But think now, my father was a slave in a Russian gulag. He was in a gulag, and he worked as a slave. I think nobody thinks about it that way, but I believe it's very much something that happened. I would look, as I said, at the first shot, I would look indeed at what they did in South Africa, but they had there the huge luck of having call it a luck, but they had Mandela, who was somebody who was uncommonly wise and had a lot of natural authority. And he led the thing. I don't know whether something similar can be pulled off in a different place. But I would think about it more in terms of if I had now a few seconds to think about a double-pronged approach. One is reconciliation with people of the caliber of Martin Luther King, who was very much into reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, trying to think about blacks, not just as black and native Indians and everybody, and in general, people who need to have support to live a more meaningful life. I don't think, my own feeling is that I wouldn't mix the two.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably a case-by-case basis. I don't know anything about the South African example. I'm going to read a little bit about that. The problem with the American model is you don't just have slavery. You also have the extermination of the Native American tribes. About 600 nations, all speaking different languages, and maybe 70 to 80 million people were here before Columbus. 90% exterminated. A case could be made, because the Native Americans alive today, living mostly on reservations in the West, they're very poor and have all kinds of social problems. So they could make a case just as well. And so my concern is once you go down that road, no matter how moral it seems, you're opening up, a whole, Pandora's box of other issues there, I think.
Could be applied in many places. I really think it's, as I said, it's a really difficult one. My own feeling would be to distinguish the financial retribution, reparation, and the other thing. They are, in a way, also you might say, there's something almost indecent about linking the two, because what the native Indians lost was not just their possessions, which were huge and valuable enough, but they lost their whole way of life. They lost so much of their culture. They lost a lot. Trying to put a tag on it is
very difficult.
Doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, you really have to take responsibility for their life. Okay,
that's good. David, thank you for coming on. That's good. Thank you for coming on the show. Again, your book is How We Misunderstand Economics and Why It Matters. I strongly recommend people read it before the 2020 election, since so much turns on economics. Even if people don't understand it, they think they're voting based on their economic interests. So it does matter for both liberals and conservatives. So thank you for writing the book. Thanks for talking to us about all these important topics.
Michael, thank you. Thank you for having me. It was really a pleasure discussing it with you.